divorcing you for someone who actually matters." I stared at the text message on my phone, my coffee growing cold in my hands. The words blurred as I read them again, trying to make sense of what my husband of 15 years had just sent me. Outside my kitchen window in Portland, Oregon, the morning rain drummed against the glass, but I barely heard it over the sound of my heart pounding. My name is Felicia Monroe, and I'm 42 years old. For the past decade, I've worked as a senior accountant at Bright Rise Systems, a manufacturing company that produces industrial equipment. I've always been the steady one, the reliable one, the one who kept our life together while my husband Darren chased his endless business dreams and startup fantasies. The notification sound from my banking app made my stomach drop. I watched in real time as thousands of dollars vanished from our joint checking account. Transfer after transfer, each one authorized by Darren's access codes. My hands shook as I scrolled through the transactions, seeing amounts that represented months of my careful budgeting disappearing to an account I didn't recognize. Another notification. This time from our savings account. The emergency fund I'd built over years of skipping vacations and buying generic groceries was being drained systematically. $25,000. Gone. I sat there in my pajamas, watching my financial security evaporate, while my husband was supposedly on a business trip to Seattle. He'd left 3 days ago with his usual vague explanations about meetings with investors and networking opportunities. I'd stopped asking for details years ago because his answers never made sense anyway. But this was different. This wasn't just another one of his failed ventures or mysterious absences. This was calculated theft, executed while he was hundreds of miles away, thinking I wouldn't notice until it was too late. My phone buzzed again. Not a text this time, but a notification from our shared cloud storage. Darren had uploaded something by accident, a screenshot of a group chat with his coworkers. My hands trembled as I opened it. "That useless failure will be homeless by Christmas," he'd written, followed by laughing emojis. "She's too weak to fight back. Always has been." His colleagues had responded with their own cruel comments, treating my potential homelessness like entertainment. They discussed how pathetic I was, how I never contributed anything meaningful to our marriage, how I was just dead weight he should have dumped years ago. I stared at those words until they burned into my memory. Useless failure. Too weak to fight back. Dead weight. Something cold and precise settled in my chest. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. I sat perfectly still for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The rain continued outside, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear our neighbor starting his car for his morning commute. Normal sounds of a normal Tuesday, while my entire world had just imploded. But as I sat there, something strange happened. The panic I expected to feel never came. Instead, a calm clarity washed over me, the same feeling I got when I was working through a particularly complex financial audit at work. My mind began organizing information, categorizing facts, building a case. I'd suspected something was wrong for months. Darren's business trips had become more frequent, his explanations more vague. He'd been protective of his phone, taking calls in other rooms, and closing his laptop whenever I walked by. There had been mysterious charges on our credit cards that he'd dismissed as business expenses, and his mood had shifted from distant to hostile whenever I asked about our finances. The signs had been there. I'd just been too trusting, too focused on maintaining the peace we'd never really had, too willing to believe that 15 years of marriage meant something to him. I thought about our early years together, when we'd met at a coffee shop near the university. I was finishing my accounting degree, and he was full of big dreams about starting his own company. He'd charmed me with his confidence, his grand plans, his certainty that success was just around the corner. I'd supported those dreams. When his first startup failed, I'd covered the bills. When he needed to invest in new opportunities, I'd taken on extra work. When his networking events required expensive dinners and drinks, I'd stretched our budget to make it work. Always believing that eventually, his efforts would pay off, and we'd build something together. Instead, I'd built everything alone while he played entrepreneur with my money. The cruelest part wasn't even the theft or the divorce threat. It was that group chat, reading how my husband and his friends laughed about my supposed weaknesses, making jokes about my future homelessness like it was comedy entertainment. They saw me as nothing more than a punchline, a burden that Darren was finally smart enough to shed. They thought I was weak because I'd been patient. They thought I was useless because I'd been supportive. They thought I was a failure because I'd prioritized our marriage over my own recognition. But what they didn't understand was that patience had taught me to plan. Support had taught me to document everything. And prioritizing our marriage had given me complete access to all our financial records, all his communications, all the evidence I needed to destroy the life he thought he was building without me. I picked up my phone and opened my notes app. Time to get organized. The first thing I did was take screenshots. Every text message, every bank notification, every cruel comment in that group chat. I saved them to a secure folder on my personal laptop, the one Darren never touched because he'd always dismissed my boring accounting work. Then I called my bank. My voice was steady as I explained the situation to the fraud department, requesting immediate freezes on all joint accounts and a detailed transaction history for the past 30 days. The representative was sympathetic, but clear about the limitations. Since Darren was an authorized user, the transfers wouldn't technically qualify as fraud unless I could prove coercion or identity theft. I assured her I understood and hung up, then immediately called our credit card companies. Same process, same results. Everything Darren had done was technically legal because we'd structured our finances as a partnership he was now systematically dismantling. But I wasn't just calling about the money. I was creating a paper trail, establishing a timeline, building documentation that would be crucial in divorce proceedings. Every phone call was noted, every reference number saved, every conversation summarized in my growing file. Next, I logged into Darren's email account. He'd given me the password years ago for convenience, and like most people, he'd never changed it. His inbox told a story I'd been too naive to see before. Months of correspondence with someone named Vanessa Clark. Hotel reservations for his business trips. Dinner receipts for 2 people when he'd told me he was eating alone. Jewelry purchases I'd never seen. And worse, conversations about their future together that made it clear this wasn't some new infatuation. This had been going on for almost a year. The emails revealed his complete financial plan. He'd been systematically moving money into accounts I couldn't access, timing the major transfers to coincide with his current trip, so I wouldn't notice until he was safely out of reach. He'd even researched divorce lawyers, specifically looking for ones who specialized in protecting assets from vindictive spouses. But the email that made my blood run cold was the one he'd sent to Vanessa just last week. Don't worry about the house. She'll never be able to afford the mortgage on her pathetic salary. We'll buy it back from the bank for pennies when she defaults. They weren't just planning to steal my money. They were planning to steal my home, the house I'd saved for, the place where I'd invested every spare dollar in improvements and repairs. They wanted to watch me lose everything, and then profit from my destruction. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Darren thought he was so clever, so strategic. He'd planned every detail of my financial ruin while making sure his friends saw him as the successful businessman, finally cutting loose his deadweight wife. He'd made one critical error, though. He'd underestimated exactly what kind of person he'd been married to for 15 years. I wasn't just an accountant. I was a forensic accountant who specialized in uncovering financial misconduct. And he'd just given me the case of my career. I spent the next 6 hours building the most comprehensive financial investigation of my life. Every document Darren thought was hidden. Every transaction he believed was secret. Every communication he assumed I'd never see. I found it all and organized it with the precision of someone who'd spent 2 decades following money trails. The scope of his deception was staggering. It wasn't just the recent transfers to Vanessa's account. For the past 18 months, Darren had been running what essentially amounted to an embezzlement scheme against his own household. Small amounts at first, a few hundred here and there, always with plausible explanations about business expenses or investment opportunities. But the amounts had grown bolder as he'd grown more confident in my ignorance. Money moved from our joint savings into a private account he'd opened without telling me. Our tax refund last year, which I'd thought went toward paying down our mortgage, had actually been redirected to fund his secret life with Vanessa. Even the expensive dinners he'd claimed were client meetings were documented in his emails. Romantic evenings where he'd taken Vanessa to restaurants we could never afford when he was taking me out for our anniversary. I cross-referenced every suspicious transaction with his email correspondence and found the pattern. The money wasn't just funding his affair. It was funding their entire future together. Down payments on apartments, deposits for weekend getaways, even a joint investment account they'd opened in preparation for their life after my expected financial collapse. The cruelest discovery was a spreadsheet he'd created titled Post-Divorce Budget. He'd calculated exactly how much money he'd have access to after dividing our assets, factoring in what he expected to keep versus what he'd have to give the old ball and chain. His projections showed him keeping the majority of our wealth while leaving me with just enough to survive, his word, in some tiny apartment. But even that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was finding the text thread where he and Vanessa discussed my reaction to the divorce. They'd placed bets on how long it would take me to completely fall apart. Vanessa had guessed 2 weeks. Darren thought I'd last less than 1. "She's never faced any real adversity," he'd written. "Always had me to handle the difficult stuff. She'll probably call her sister crying and begging me to come back within 48 hours. They'd planned this entire scenario like a game, treating my anticipated suffering as entertainment. They wanted me to beg. They wanted me to break down. They wanted proof that I was as weak and pathetic as they'd always believed. I saved every screenshot, every document, every piece of evidence. Then I did something Darren would never expect. I started making phone calls. The first call was to my sister Jennifer, not to cry or beg for help, but to ask if she still knew that private investigator she'd used during her own divorce. She did, and by 3 p.m., I had a consultation scheduled for the next morning. The second call was to my lawyer, not a divorce attorney. I'd handle that later. This was to the corporate lawyer who'd helped me with financial documentation when Brightrise Systems had faced an embezzlement investigation 2 years ago. I needed expert advice on asset protection and evidence preservation. The third call was the most important one. I dialed the main number for Gravora Group, the financial services company where Darren worked as a senior portfolio manager. I'd met his boss, William Thorne, several times at company events. He'd always seemed like a decent man, someone who took ethics seriously. "Mr. Thorne," I said, when his assistant connected me. "This is Felicia Monroe, Darren Monroe's wife. I have some information about financial misconduct that I believe violates company policy. Would it be possible to schedule a meeting?" There was a pause. "What kind of misconduct, Mrs. Monroe?" "The kind that involves stealing money and violating fiduciary trust. The kind that could expose your company to serious liability if it becomes public." Another pause. "Can you be here tomorrow at 10 a.m.? "I'll be there." I hung up and looked at my growing file of evidence. Darren thought he'd planned the perfect crime, the perfect escape, the perfect humiliation of his useless wife. He'd forgotten that his useless wife had access to everything. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I cooked myself a proper dinner. Not the quick sandwiches or frozen meals I'd been surviving on while working late and managing our household alone, but an actual meal with fresh ingredients and careful preparation. As I chopped vegetables and seasoned chicken, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Calm. Not the nervous energy of trying to keep peace with Darren, not the exhaustion of constantly managing crises he created, but genuine tranquility. For the first time in our marriage, I knew exactly what was going to happen next, because I was the one controlling the situation. My phone buzzed constantly with texts from Darren. He'd apparently expected me to respond to his divorce announcement with panic or pleading. Instead, I'd gone silent, and it was clearly bothering him. "Did you get my message?" he wrote at 6 p.m. "We need to discuss logistics," came another text an hour later. By 9 p.m., his messages had shifted to irritation. "Don't ignore me, Felicia. This is happening whether you like it or not." I deleted each message without responding, but not before screenshotting them for my file. Every communication was evidence of his character, his intentions, and his complete lack of concern for the devastation he was causing. Around 10 p.m., my phone rang. Darren's name on the caller ID. I almost declined, but then realized this might be an opportunity to gather more evidence. I answered and immediately put the call on speaker while opening my voice recording app. "Finally," he said, his voice sharp with annoyance. "I was starting to think you'd had some kind of breakdown." "Hello, Darren. How's your business trip going?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Fine. Great, actually. Look, we need to talk about the practical aspects of this divorce. I've already consulted with a lawyer, and there are things we need to sort out." "Such as?" "The house, obviously. You can't afford the mortgage on your salary, so we'll need to sell it quickly. My attorney says if we're cooperative about the timeline, we can avoid a lot of unnecessary legal fees." I kept my voice perfectly neutral. "How thoughtful of you to be concerned about my finances." "Don't be sarcastic, Felicia. I'm trying to make this as painless as possible. You'll get your share of the proceeds, and that should be enough for you to find something more appropriate to your budget. And what about our joint accounts? I noticed some significant activity today." There was a pause. When he spoke again, his tone was more defensive. "I transferred some funds to secure temporary housing. It's expensive to start over, and I need liquid assets to cover immediate expenses." $25,000 worth of immediate expenses. You don't understand the complexities of this situation. There are legal fees, deposits, moving costs. It's not as simple as you think. I let the silence stretch, waiting to see what else he'd reveal. "Look," he continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "I know this is difficult for you to process. You've always depended on me to handle the complicated decisions. But this is what's best for both of us. You'll see that eventually." "Will I?" "Yes. You're not cut out for the kind of life I need to live. You never understood my ambitions, my potential. Vanessa gets it. She supports my goals instead of constantly questioning them." There it was. He'd said her name himself, on a recorded call, confirming the affair I'd already documented through his emails. "I see. And does Vanessa understand the complexities of your current financial situation?" "What do you mean?" "Nothing important. I'm sure you've explained everything to her clearly." After we hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen, listening to the rain that had never stopped falling. Tomorrow, I would walk into William Thorne's office and lay out 15 years' worth of evidence about the man Gravora Group had trusted with their clients' money. Darren thought he was building a new life with Vanessa using stolen funds and careful deception. Instead, he was about to lose everything he'd ever worked for. I arrived at Gravora Group's downtown Portland office at 9:45 a.m., carrying a leather portfolio that contained what would become the most important presentation of my career. The building was impressive, 30 floors of glass and steel that housed one of the Pacific Northwest's most respected financial services firms. William Thorne met me in the lobby personally, which told me he was taking this seriously. He was a tall, distinguished man in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded respect without effort. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "Thank you for coming in. I must admit your call yesterday was quite concerning." "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice, Mr. Thorne. I believe you'll understand the urgency once you see what I've brought." He led me to a conference room on the 20th floor, with panoramic views of the city and the Willamette River beyond. As we settled at the polished table, I opened my portfolio and began laying out documents with the systematic precision I'd learned in 20 years of accounting work. Before we begin, I said, I want to be clear about my motivations. This isn't about revenge or spite. This is about protecting your company from a significant liability risk that you may not be aware of. Thorne leaned forward, his expression serious. What kind of liability? I slid the first document across the table, a summary sheet I'd prepared showing Darren's financial misconduct over the past 18 months. Your employee has been systematically stealing marital assets while representing your firm. He's used company credit cards for personal expenses, falsified business trip reports, and conducted an extramarital affair using funds that were obtained through fraudulent means. Thorne's eyes widened as he scanned the document. These are serious allegations, Mrs. Monroe. They're also thoroughly documented. I began laying out evidence methodically. Bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers, printed emails revealing the scope of the affair, screenshots of the group chat where Darren had discussed his plans with colleagues. But the document that made Thorne's face go pale was Darren's expense report from his current business trip to Seattle. I'd cross-referenced every claimed expense with his email correspondence and found that he was billing the company for a romantic getaway with Vanessa. He submitted receipts for client dinners, I explained, pointing to the relevant sections. But his emails show these were intimate dinners with his girlfriend. He claimed transportation costs for business meetings, but GPS data from his phone, which syncs to our shared cloud account, shows he spent the entire time at a luxury resort outside the city. Thorne studied the evidence with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at. This represents a clear violation of our ethics policy. But beyond that, if this becomes public knowledge, it could damage Gravora Group's reputation significantly, I finished. A senior portfolio manager who steals from his own household and lies on expense reports isn't someone clients would trust with their investments. No, they wouldn't. He looked up from the documents. Mrs. Monroe, may I ask why you're bringing this to me instead of simply pursuing divorce proceedings? It was a fair question, and I'd prepared for it. Because divorce proceedings are public record. If this information comes out in court, it becomes a matter of public interest. Reporters love stories about financial professionals who can't manage their own ethics. Your company would be caught in the aftermath of media coverage you didn't deserve. And if we handle this internally, then it remains a private personnel matter, clean, quiet, and contained. Thorne was quiet for a long moment, reviewing the evidence again. Finally, he looked up. What outcome are you seeking? Justice, I said simply, and consequences that match the severity of the misconduct. He nodded slowly. I'll need to consult with our legal department and board of directors. But based on what you've shown me, I can tell you that Darren's employment status will be under immediate review. As I left the building, I felt the same calm certainty I'd experienced the night before. Phase 1 was complete. Now, it was time for Phase 2. By Friday morning, exactly 3 days after Darren's divorce text, everything began to fall apart for him in ways he never could have anticipated. I was at my desk at Brightrise Systems when my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but I recognized the area code, Seattle, where Darren was supposedly conducting business. Hello? Is this Felicia Monroe? The voice belonged to a young woman who sounded nervous. Yes, this is Felicia. This is Vanessa Clark. I think we need to talk. I kept my voice carefully neutral. Do we? Darren told me you were separated. He said you'd been living apart for months, that the divorce was mutual. But after what happened this morning? What happened this morning? He got fired. Security came to the hotel and escorted him out. They said he was being terminated for financial misconduct and that there was an investigation. He's completely falling apart, saying someone sabotaged him, that his wife must have done something. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch. The thing is, Vanessa continued, her voice getting smaller, I think he's been lying to me about a lot of things. The money he's been spending on me. He said it came from his bonus. But now I'm wondering if it was your money. Our money. I found out this morning that he's still wearing his wedding ring when he thinks I'm not looking. I see. I'm not a homewrecker, Mrs. Monroe. I would never have gotten involved if I'd known the truth. I'm driving back to Portland today, and I think you should know that I've already closed the account he was transferring money to. I'm prepared to return everything. After she hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. Darren's perfectly planned new life was crumbling, and he didn't even understand why yet. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is all your fault. You destroyed everything. How could you be so vindictive?" I deleted it without responding. Darren still didn't understand that this wasn't about vindictiveness. This was about consequences. The following Monday brought news that exceeded even my expectations. William Thorne called me personally to inform me that Gravora Group's board had voted unanimously to terminate Darren's employment effective immediately. But that wasn't all. Our investigation revealed additional irregularities beyond what you initially reported, Thorne explained. It appears your husband had been padding his expense accounts for over 2 years. The total amount exceeds $50,000. Will there be criminal charges? That's being reviewed by our legal department. At minimum, we're pursuing full restitution. But Mrs. Monroe, there's something else you should know. We've been contacted by the Securities and Exchange Commission. Apparently, Darren's conduct has triggered a broader investigation into his client accounts. The SEC investigation was something I hadn't anticipated, but it made perfect sense. A portfolio manager who stole from his own household and falsified company records couldn't be trusted with client investments. Every transaction he'd made, every recommendation he'd given, every account he'd managed would now be scrutinized for evidence of misconduct. That afternoon, I received a call from my attorney with even better news. "Felicia, I've reviewed all the evidence you provided, and I have to say, this is one of the most comprehensive cases I've ever seen. With the documentation you've gathered, we can not only recover all the stolen funds, but also pursue additional damages for financial fraud. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Given the strength of our evidence, I expect Darren's attorney will recommend a settlement rather than risk this going to trial. No lawyer wants to defend a case this well documented." That evening, I finally responded to one of Darren's increasingly desperate text messages. "The house keys are under the planter by the front door," I wrote. "Your belongings are packed and waiting in the garage. The locks have been changed." I turned off my phone and poured myself a glass of wine. Justice had never tasted so sweet. As I settled into my quiet house that Christmas Eve, surrounded by friends who'd supported me through the hardest year of my life, I realized that Darren had been right about one thing. I had been too weak to fight back. But weakness, I'd learned, was just another word for choosing your battles carefully. And when I finally chose to fight, I fought to win completely.